Okay, I show 3:30, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us late on this Tuesday afternoon towards the end of the conference. I think it's probably an indication of those who are dedicated and those that are running from hurricanes all at the same time, so we appreciate you guys being with us here this afternoon. My name is Craig Hartley, and I have the great pleasure of working for the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. Many of you probably have known us as CALEA. Now, I have to tell you up front, this class has nothing to do about accreditation at all. We just happen to sit in a very good position where we work with a lot of wonderful agencies. And because of that, as a credentialing organization now for 40 years, we're able to identify folks that can bring a lot of resources to the table and serve as resources for you in events like this. On that particular note, over the past several years, we have all seen a perpetual shift in things that law enforcement and other public safety professionals are responsible for. And it really seems this is a never-ending emerging issues of events that really emanate from legitimate concerns from the communities themselves. As an example, and many of you will know these stories well, that you may have been impacted by things like mass shootings or terror-related events, or at least the planning for these events have been part of your responsibilities. But what really becomes difficult is when you're forced to address the underlying causes and even social issues that sometimes contribute to these horrible events, where sometimes the solutions take us to these politically charged discussions too, and they always end up somehow at the doorstep of the police. In many ways, the police find themselves responsible for public safety and security now in new ways, and often struggle to find this balance between the various philosophical roles either anchored to community engagement or safety, and we always know that those two things are not always complementary. I can specifically remember from my policing days an old commander telling me that I can make your city safe, but you're probably not going to like my methods too well in making that happen, and we know the balance has to be there. You know, I was talking to some folks earlier this afternoon that we are absolutely in the business of saving lives. And even though that's the case, this whole issue of dealing with overdoses in communities now has really put medical devices and other things in police cars that I can tell you that when I was doing the police thing in the 1980s, I could not imagine having that type of equipment in my car and having to wrestle with some of the issues that police administrators are dealing with today. So that's to say, in a lot of ways, that the police are now more responsible for things than they ever have been in the past, and we anticipate that'll continue to grow. The panelists today are going to try to provide some perspective on these and other demands for police services, and will really provide some insights on what they think the future holds for the engagement with the community and other sections of government and other public entities in resolving some of these types of issues that you certainly have to face in the roles that you sit in. They're going to also provide some insights on community expectation of law enforcement services and what the future may hold in that regard as well. And we'll hope to solicit some of their ideas and thoughts really on the nexus of policy, training, and standards themselves to determine sometimes what changes might be necessary as we move forward to maintain community trust and safety, and again, manage community expectations. Again, because we are in a very fortunate role of working with progressive leadership in public safety, we have been able to identify 3 panelists for this discussion today that have really linked and interesting perspectives. Each of them are from the city of Wyoming, Michigan, and they include the current chief of police, the former chief of police, he's the one that looks happier, and the current city manager. We hope this looking back and looking forward cadre of folks will provide some perspective for you and provoke some discussion that you can take away today. So let me introduce these folks to you to kind of get our meeting going here. Curtis Holt serves as the city manager for the city of Wyoming, Michigan. He has served in that capacity now for over 18 years, and he joined that organization in 1996 as the deputy city manager. His previous experience includes city manager of Otsego, Michigan, and assistant city manager of Cedar Springs. And Curtis holds a master's degree in public administration from Grand Valley State University. He presently serves as the chair for the Kent County Dispatch Authority and has served as a commissioner for CALEA. He's a board member and past chair of the Regional Geographical Information Services of Grand Valley Metro Council and is the vice chair of the Grand Valley Regional Biosolid Authority. Also with us today is Chief Kimberly Koster, who is the current chief for the city of Wyoming, Michigan. Kim has been with that agency more than 20 years. in law enforcement, and she began her law enforcement career there as a school resource and community policing officer, I think, and then progressed through the supervisory ranks while also having various administrative and operational responsibilities. Kim has a unique experience of working in a police, fire, quasi-public safety organizational structure that certainly broadens her perspective on public safety responsibilities. And finally, the happy guy again is the retired chief. Jim Carmody is with us today, and he began his police adventure, if you will, with the Port Huron Police Department in 1975. Then in 2006, he was selected as the chief of Wyoming PD. By 2013, his responsibilities expanded as he managed the development of a joint public safety department for both police and fire services there. And under his leadership, the city secured its initial accreditation, developed cross-training for city employees to be able to serve on firefighter-type calls, and he instituted a community policing model to place officers in every Wyoming school. In 2016, he was recognized as the Police Chief of the Year by the Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police. So we certainly thank each of you for being here with us today. And with that, Mr. Manager Holt, I will turn the floor to you for opening comments, my friend.
Well, I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to be joined by the panelists I'm with today. I've had the pleasure to hire both of them in their chief's position, and I've always thought that they're some of the best decisions I've ever made as a city manager. But let me start by telling you a little bit about the city of Wyoming. The city of Wyoming is what probably nationally is considered a pretty small town, but in the state of Michigan, a pretty large city of about 75,000 people. We sit in West Michigan. We're a first-ring suburb to the city of Grand Rapids. We're the third largest city in West Michigan, and probably the second largest police force of municipal departments in our area. We're a full-service city. We have our own water, sewer, public works, parks and recreation, and do all those things. Our city has changed quite dramatically over the years, and it's really, I think, important that we start with where we were in 1996 when I came to the city of Wyoming. We're a city that our police department was mainly known as cowboys, that they kind of served on an island. There was a local radio station that did a cop in and cop out promotion at the local donut shop. And it was just somewhat of a laughing stock kind of community in terms of its police department. We, in 2006, went before the voters and asked for some funding to support our police department. The voters said no. They didn't support us. They didn't support what we were doing. And as a result, we laid off approximately 20 police officers, a bunch of firefighters, about 10% of our public safety staff, and about 30% of our city staff overall. They were pretty dark days in the city of Wyoming, and we said, and had to figure out what was it that we were doing that we weren't getting through to our public. So we set out and did a few things. And the first thing we started to do, and the way we felt we had to get back to our citizens, was to communicate with them. And we had to talk to them, and we had to survey, and we had to be out in our public, and we had to talk to them all the time. You know, today we hear a lot about social media, and we hear about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all those things. And a lot of times we'll see city council members that want to react to those types of comments. But we really work hard to talk to our council and say, remember, we have 75,000 residents. Our Facebook likes, or the people following us, are about 4,000, 5,000. Our Twitter followers are around 1,000. So does that really represent our entire city when you see a comment on Twitter or Facebook or a comment at the end of the article? So when we talk about communication, we also talked about communication not only with our citizens, but how do we communicate with our own inner city departments? How do we work together? How do we form a team to make the city of Wyoming better? But the other issue was, how do we talk to our city council? And one of the things we've worked on very hard is to talk to our council about how do we be positive with our citizens. If our council is out there and they're talking about our police or our fire or our public works, in not such a great way or in a negative way, how do we expect our citizens to react any differently? If we don't even have the trust of our council, how do we get the trust of our citizens? So we've really worked on that, and you'll find today that our council members are very positive. And since that time, what we've been able to do is we've been able to ask for funding again. And we've asked for funding 3 different times. They've all been renewals, and we're now approaching a 70% approval when we walk out and we talk to our citizens. But we've not only communicated with them, we've created relationships. And we've created relationships with our council members because our chief comes to all of our council meetings, and even if we don't have something on the agenda, they talk to them, and they talk to council members, and they tell them what's going on, and they communicate with them, and they communicate with the residents that come to our council meetings, and they talk about police service and fire service and what we do. We also went to the council and we said, we're going to be more accountable to our citizens. And you know, every year, most cities, I think all cities, do a financial audit. And we do a financial audit every year, just like most cities, and we don't do that because we're looking for something wrong. We do it because we want to make sure that we're performing to the highest standards possible. So we said, how do we do that in other areas? And we've gone out, and we were accredited in CALEA, and we went out and we told our residents that, and we talked about performing to best practices and how do we perform to best practices. And we do that with, we talk about biosolids and simple things like biosolids, and we're looking at fire accreditation and doing it across all venues in the city because we feel it's important that we show our council and we show our citizens that we're accountable to them. And we're not accountable by just saying, hey, look at us, look what we've done. We're accountable because we have outside people come in, experts in the field, and look at us and say, yeah, you're doing a pretty good job. We also have really practiced hard and focused hard on becoming an open government. And how do we become an open government? Well, we're very transparent. You know, it's a word I don't really like a whole lot. I think it's overused in government. But if you look at our websites and you look at our Facebook and you look at our Twitter, we publish virtually everything we do. You look at, you know, we don't try and hide anything. And we don't hide anything because I tell the council, if we're not proud of what we do, then why are we doing it? If we can't talk about it and say we're proud of, we're doing it this way, and does that mean that we're perfect? No, we're not perfect at all. But when we find what we're not perfect with, we're also accountable for that, and we make the corrections to be better. So we talk about expectations, and one of the things that Craig asked us to talk about are expectations for the future. And what do I expect of my police chief? And what do I expect of our department heads, and especially the police chief? And those things are that you're going to communicate, and you're going to talk to me, and you're going to let us know what's going on, and we're going to communicate what we can to the public, and we're going to communicate what we can to our council. And sometimes those messages are different. We don't hide. We don't run and hide and say, this happened, so we can't talk about it. Let's be public. Let's talk about it, and let's be honest about what's happened, how we've dealt with it, and what we're going to do in the future. The other expectation I have in the future, and I've always had for our police chief, that you're part of our team. You're part of the city management team. So we meet, and we meet with not only individually every month, but we meet as a group monthly, and we talk about what's going on in the city. And we don't talk about, is it a police incident or a fire incident? How do we make our city better? How do we talk to our council members about how do we create their expectations for the future? How do we help them with their expectations for the future? And how are we going to work with them to educate them on a regular basis? And that education is how we get our council members to understand what we're doing and talk to us in a positive way. So we often say that when we talk to our council members, we can't just talk to them once, and we can't just talk to them twice, but we're going to probably talk to them 5, 6, 7 times before we bring something in and say, will you do this? Will you approve this? Will you approve new in-car video or whatever it is that we're doing at that particular time. You know, I'll just wrap this up by saying, or my part of this up by saying that, you know, our city councils have changed. The expectations of our cities and our residents have changed. We used to have residents who came and volunteered in Rotary clubs and Optimist clubs, and they built playgrounds, and they built parks, and they did all of those things. I think nationally we've kind of seen that fall off, and we see that civic engagement isn't quite the same anymore. People who run for council are looking for higher office, and they want to do something different, and they want to make their mark. Our citizens are expecting us to know exactly what happened, how it affected my child or me individually every day. So how can we do that? And how can we do that every day when we're also in an era where people are asking us to do more with less? We're in a generation where no new taxes is a theme that we hear all the time. In the state of Michigan, we have tax limitations on us on how much our revenues can grow every year. So how can we be all things to all people every year if we don't have the money to be all things to all people? Well, we do that because we educate and we talk. And we talk to our council members and we talk about how are we doing today? What is it that we need? We've gone to our council and we've told them when we have a big case going on, and we've said, here's what it takes to investigate a murder. And here's how it started day one. Here's how many of our people were involved. Here's how many hours it took. Here's how much it cost. And we give them as much information as we can. The world is changing around you. It's always going to be changing. I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know. But if we're not willing to accept that it is changing and react to it, then we're not going to be able to meet the expectations of the future either. So thank you, and I'll hand it off here.
Curtis, thanks for being with us here today. One of the values of having a city manager here in this environment and this platform is where you can ask questions as a person that works for a municipal organization or state organization that has public safety responsibilities about what those expectations are from his perspective. And we hope as this thing progresses, you feel comfortable asking that question, because I haven't worked for a city manager as well, know that those things don't always marry up nicely. So as we move forward with some of these discussions, think about those questions you wouldn't mind asking Curtis to help others learn as well. We also, as I told you before, have Chief Costner with us here today. And again, she is the current Chief of Police for the city there. And we asked Chief Costner to talk about her perspective on future issues, and we welcome you here today, Chief.
Okay, thank you, Craig. In full disclosure, like Craig mentioned in the bio, I've been a chief for about 4 months. So I'm still in field training, and I think I've been extended a little bit. So it's been trial by fire. It's been a good job so far. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the current climate and expectations for law enforcement. And I think in order to do so, we have to really talk about two separate climates. The first one that's really created nationally by the media and by social media and bloggers and everyone else who likes to chime in on what they think about law enforcement and how we're doing our jobs. The expectations from that national climate and the media is for us to perform to perfection. And that's defined by every individual according to their own experiences, their opinions, and their biases. And the consequences for not meeting those expectations can be life-altering, as you've seen. Sometimes we're operating in no-win situations, and we have to know what the outcome is before we even get started. We have no ability to pause or rewind in these situations or to hit the restart button. So that it can be frustrating at times, I think, but I think what we need to do is look at the second climate, which is a climate that's cultivated locally. We cultivate it within our own communities, and it differs from the national perspective. It's critical that we ask ourselves, what does our community believe, and what do they expect from us? As Curtis mentioned, we passed a millage by more than 70%, an overwhelming sign of approval from our own community. Our own community interactions and show of support tell us how much our community values us. I can't tell you, I can't go a week without somebody saying, hey, thank you, showing a sign of support. I go to pay for my coffee and someone's already paid it. And I hear that story over and over again from our officers. We do community surveys as part of our accreditation process. So we actually ask our community, what would they like? What are your expectations? And they tell us. And because how do you know if you don't ask? So, and what they tell us is, we'd like you to go back to some of the basics. They'll tell us speeding is one of the major concerns, or larceny from motor vehicles. I just want my kids to be safe when they go to school. I want the neighborhood to be a safe place to raise a family and for the kids to play. They show they have an overwhelming respect for our agency, and they believe that our officers are capable and that they're professional. So again, I think that there are two climates, and it's important that we pay attention to our local climate and make sure that our city council sees that. I also think it's important that our officers are reminded of that every day, and that we also remind our community. And that involves being, again, like Curtis said, transparent and accountable. Through the accreditation process, we've done that. We've cultivated positive relationships. We communicate and engage and educate the public. Like many of you, we use social media, Facebook, Twitter. Nextdoor.com is a valuable tool to us. More than 10% of our population, of our city's population, is on Nextdoor. So this isn't like Facebook land where you could be reaching some guy out in California who's chiming in on what you did or did not do right, but Nextdoor is actually your own community, and they'll tell you what their expectations are. You can communicate with them, you can respond to them, you can educate them about your events and what you have coming up, answer any of the concerns they have. So I would encourage you to really utilize Nextdoor.com. We also have a community policing philosophy that's department-wide. We have school checks where every day, every officer in their patrol beat is required to go to every school in their patrol district. We just ask them to, hey, stop in, talk to the principal, walk the halls, go around the playground, maybe stop in the lunchroom, write your report in the parking lot. Just make a presence at every school, every day in your district. And this really just started with Sandy Hook, the terrible tragedy that happened there. And on that day, we sent officers to every school, and we thought, let's send officers there and show parents that we're concerned and that we're there to make sure their kids are safe. And what it actually did was the opposite. The parents were concerned and wondering why were the police there, and it actually created panic. So we decided we needed to make this a practice so that police officers being at the school wasn't something that they should be alarmed about. It's just a matter of practice, and it's just normal for us to be there. And also we figured anyone who was thinking about doing something at the school would drive by and periodically would never know when they would see a cruiser or an officer. And that's in addition to the regular school resource officers that we have assigned to the schools. We also do business checks. Stop in at our local businesses. We require every business in our city to be contacted twice a year by the afternoon shift. And then our night shift officers are out doing property checks at night, where they leave a card in the business owner's door just saying, hey, we were here, we checked your property. And it's amazing how much they appreciate that. We actually had some business owners come to city council, and again, that's that communication and education with the council. The business owners come and say how much they appreciate that and why they love having their business in our city. We also educate and engage the citizens through the normal routes of academies and open houses and special events, and we continue to engage our youth. Chief Carmody started the Chiefs Advisory Council, and I will continue that. Basically, he gathered groups of kids at each local high school, picked by the staff, not all A students, really a cross-section of A, B, C, D, and E, I guess, and just got these kids to come in, a diverse group that could come in and talk about what issues were concerning to them. They got to talk about what they think about the police and questions that they have about why police do the things they do. And they just really actually got to know Chief Carmody, which is really a pretty cool thing. And at the end of the year, all of the students from all of his groups came together, and we had one big assembly at the police department. And it was incredible how much they loved the chief. They all wanted their picture taken with him, but I just think about these kids going home and talking to their families about, yeah, we talked to the chief today, or their friends saying, hey, where are you going? How come you always get to skip out on this hour? And it's, well, you know, I get to go meet with the chief. So I just think it's a really good tool for us to connect with our youth. And like Curtis said, we really do a good job of communicating with the city manager and the assistant city manager. One of the things we did recently, we provide them now with command notifications. In our department, when something happens, usually in the evening hours, but when something happens that's noteworthy that the chief or the chief or the captains or the command group needs to know about, the sergeant types out a command notification. Say it was a robbery, a homicide, suicide, something like that. They'll type out a short description and send it off on this notification system. We decided we would add Curtis Holt and Megan Saw, the assistant city manager, to that notification system. So now every time we have some major incident, Curtis is getting a notification. And I think it just helps him to get a feel for really what's going on in the community. And you know, when we have an increase in suicides, for example, the assistant city manager says to me, wow, I never realized that, or you know, just some of the stuff that happens, they wouldn't know about it if we didn't include them in on that. So our assistant city managers conducted ride-alongs with the police department, fire department, public works. Again, like Curtis said, we attend the city council meetings, and we're involved in council retreats. And we partner with other city departments because we're one big team really trying to keep the community safe. So we partner with a lot of the other city departments. We just had Find the Rock in the park. So it was a rock that public safety put there. We put that out on Nextdoor, and people were getting out in the parks and looking for a rock that we had painted and put there, and it was generated some excitement. So, but what are the expectations that we put on our officers looking into the future? We're asking them to take responsibility for social issues. And these are social issues that really need to be solved by our legislators, but they're too busy worrying about other things, arguing about things that, if you talk to cops, don't really matter because we're on the street. I think if you want to know what's going on in this country, talk to cops because they know what's going on and they're dealing with these situations. Addiction, the opioid crisis, for example. The U.S. Department of Health says more than 130 people are dying every day from opioid overdoses. And it's going to require a multifaceted response, and enforcement alone isn't going to fix this. But we're sending our officers there. We're equipping them with Narcan, something that, you know, like Craig said, I can't believe that we have to do this kind of thing today. We don't have EpiPens and we don't have insulin, but we're carrying Narcan. We go into homes and see people whose lives have been destroyed by drugs, and their families are, you know, wondering what they can possibly do to help their children suffering from these addictions. So, I mean, it takes a toll on our officers, and it's going to take more than police to solve this problem, but it's on our shoulders. The mental health crisis in this country goes right along with that addiction and opioid problem that we have, because half of the people who are addicted also have mental illnesses, and half of the people with mental illnesses have addictions. So the national numbers suggest that 1.2 million people suffer from mental illness, are incarcerated in our jails and prisons. So what does that tell you? We're putting people with mental illness in prison versus getting them help. Some of them need to be there, but our county jail estimates that 40% of the inmates are or have been on medication for a mental illness. So just this year, our county launched a specialized court program for defendants suffering from mental illness. I guess my last statements are, how do we support our officers through this climate? We're asking them to be everything to everyone. We're asking them to be parents because parents are absent or ineffective. We're asking them to be principals and teachers because our society has reduced the authority of our educators and increased liability. We're asking them to be mental health workers because there are no other options. We're asking them to be social workers because there's nobody else to call for help at that time. We're asking them, again, to be addiction specialists, medical health personnel. We're asking them to use AEDs, which I'm not against. I'm just saying these are additional responsibilities that we're asking our officers to do. We're asking them to be counselors and mediators because civil discourse in this country right now is at an all-time low. So we're going to calls over sprinklers, hitting my pavement or ridiculous things that neighbors can't talk about anymore. And how can we support our officers through this? I guess at the Wyoming Police Department, Chief Carmody really focused on officer wellness. And we had an officer wellness program where we allowed our officers to combine their breaks and work out on duty because we know that working out can help you with that. We really aimed the program at mind, body, and soul, and it was a holistic approach to officer wellness. We brought in speakers about financial health and marriage issues, just recognizing that officers suffer from a lot of stress, and it comes out in a number of different ways. We developed a peer support team, so if we saw that somebody was having difficulty, there was a peer that could stop by and check up on them after critical incidents. They would do that especially. We have critical incident stress debriefings where the officers get together with a group of people that are trained to talk about what they experienced and help them prepare for what might be coming. And then just a simple phone call or two is very helpful. And I can tell you that because we are talking about how the city government really plays a role, that whenever we've had a critical incident, it's Curtis that calls, it's the human resources director that calls, it's somebody working in accounting that sends a text message, it's people from all across the city that call and say, how are your people doing? And that's when I know that we've created a team that is really aimed at, again, keeping the community safe and really providing all the resources that are needed for our residents. So looking forward to the questions.
Kimberly, thank you for being here with us too. In preparation for this event, it's amazing that we talked about what technologies existed, what impacts those have on organizations like public safety entities and others in that particular profession. And we're going to talk a little bit as we move forward. We're going to move to Mr. Carmody with us here too. But Kim, before we leave that, we're going to plant the seed for this discussion about, with all those things coming forward and those future issues that are certainly on you, how do you manage as a new chief looking to control where you draw the line in the sand and say no more? Now we'll come back to that, Jim, but I want to make sure we get to that point because the issue on this particular training session is about managing the future in some way and being prepared for those events. So we'll let you sit on that one a little bit, and I'll introduce Jim Carmody again. And Jim has been a long time friend of mine, and he's going to talk a little bit about the progression from his perspective of being in the role for 40 plus years. I don't need to remind you that I think I was in high school when you started, so don't let you feel too bad. But we asked Jim to talk a little bit about the perspective of the growth that he saw and really what he worries about for Kim as she moves forward from his perspective as a senior chief. So Jim, thanks and welcome.
Thanks, Craig, and thank you for being here today. It's always an honor to speak before a group of colleagues who share the same concerns, obviously, in our ever-changing world. And when I retired, the news media shows up and they want to know, what differences have I seen in law enforcement in 4 decades, and what are some of the changes? And I very quickly come back and say, wait, you people say we need to change. That's all I hear from the media is the police need to change. And well, we've been changing, and I can tell you after 40 years in law enforcement, we've made some tremendous changes. Unfortunately, people aren't recognizing that. And to some extent, that might be a little bit on our shoulders as well. But one of the things that we continue to hear from people is at that narrative. What's that narrative about current law enforcement? And your staff, your officers on the street will talk about the narrative, the negative narrative. And really, what is that narrative? What do the people in this country think about law enforcement? And when you look at recent polls that have been done, it's astounding. And these are independent polls. These aren't MACP or the Michigan Association Chiefs or the International Association Chiefs of Police or your local surveys. These are independent surveys. The Pew Group, Gallup poll in 2016 did a survey on how much respect, how much people respected law enforcement. And it was incredible when you look at the numbers. 76% of the Americans said they have a great deal of respect for the law enforcement profession. It's a 12% increase from the previous survey they did 2 years prior to that. 17% said they have some respect. Well, Gallup doesn't go into any great detail to define what some means, but as opposed to that, only 7% of the people that they surveyed said that they have little or no respect for law enforcement. And I think a good percentage of those people I put in jail myself. So that doesn't surprise any of us, does it really? So, you know, when you look at respect defined, it's really about esteem, being held in esteem, people respecting our profession. And, you know, you'll talk to officers, and nobody respects us, nobody cares about us and stuff, and you really need to understand that there is the greatest percentage of people we serve truly do care for what we do. Most recently, they did a survey, a little bit different, on how much confidence people had in certain professions. Law enforcement came in third. Small businesses, the military, and then law enforcement. And 54% of those surveyed indicated that they had tremendous confidence in the law enforcement profession. And again, another percentage, it was a little over 20-some% of those people that were surveyed said they have some. And again, not defining what some means, but obviously they've got some confidence in the things that we do. But part of that definition of confidence comes, the word that we continue to hear is trust. Building trust in the community. How do we build trust in the community? Trust with some of the people we serve. So I thought that was interesting, and we have made it a practice in our organization, and as Kim's already alluded to, that we make sure that the officers hear that. When things would get dark, something would be happening in the country that was negative about law enforcement, we would remind officers, who are you hearing from? You're hearing from people who have a vested interest in getting in front of the camera and speaking their minds. And not to say that those things shouldn't have been brought forward. Terrible things have happened, there's no question about that. But they are not defining us as a profession. They are not the people that we serve every night. They have a vested interest and they're serving themselves in most cases for that. So, but when you look at the breakdown, even by ethnicity in this community, 2 of 3 Hispanic or African American people in this country have tremendous confidence in what we do. And we need to communicate that, not only to our staff, but communicate that back to our communities as well. And we've talked about, you know, how do we take an organization and as Curtis uses the word accountability, those are all the buzzwords, 21st century policing, transparency, accountability, training, policies and procedures for organizations. Those are things that have been in effect in most police departments for a long time. And when you look at the communities that we serve, you begin to ask the question, what are those expectations? What does my community want? When I started law enforcement in '75, I started as a police officer in the city I grew up in. So when people talk about community policing, I really didn't make any connection with that, because community policing with me was policing in the community I grew up in. I knew people, I knew the business owners, people I went to school with. So part of my engagement as a police officer was interacting with the people in our community. When I came to Wyoming, I didn't know anybody. You know, on the west side of the state, completely different culture, completely different social makeup. And so the only thing that I could do at that point as a new chief is to go out there and make myself available to the people in the community. I stopped into businesses and talked with business owners, stopped into the schools, talked with the school principals, stopped into different church organizations, began to interact with people, because the most important thing for me when I left the east side of the state was I left a lot of relationships. So I had to rebuild those relationships. People needed to get to know who Jim Carmody was before they knew who the chief was. And so that was a practice that I started and maintained throughout the 12 years that I was the chief in that community, and made good friends in the process, built relationships as we went along. When we talk about, that narrative, the question is, as an organization, we have to reach out to every aspect of the community. How much time are we spending trying to focus on that smaller percentage of people that in most cases we're not really going to have a tremendous impact on in changing their thought process? We shouldn't give up on that. I'm not saying that we should, but are we doing that at the expense of giving up to the 70 or 80 or 90% of the people who have that trust in us as a professional organization? How much time are we spending nurturing that relationship? And that's where it came into play when some of the programs that we put out there was to engage the community as a whole, not focus on one particular aspect. The school programs I thought were incredible, because I got to sit down with young kids who for the most part get written off. And I was amazed at what I learned from these young people. They were so interested to learn about what I did for a living. And I didn't hear the things that I would hear at a national level. About 80% of the kids that we had in our classes were African American or Latino. And it was just very interesting from their perspective how they looked at us. And they just had simple questions that most kids have. Why do you do this? Why do you do that? How do you do this? How do you do that? But what I found is that they pay less attention to that narrative out there than most other people. And so we obviously communicated to that. We brought in other officers, so it wasn't just my face in there all the time. We brought in other staff members that they could meet. But it was instrumental in building those relationships. I asked them one day to go home, do a little experiment. I said, go home and say, I've had so much fun with Chief Carmody in the classroom. I think I want to be a police officer, and see what mom and dad say. And I expected all kinds of really negative responses. And we got back together. What I found out was most cases, the objection was, no, you want to be a doctor, you want to be this, you want to be that, you really want to be a police officer. Or the mom said, quote unquote, hell no, it's too dangerous, you're going to get hurt. But not one of those kids came back with any negative connotation because of what people believe that we represent. And I was really impacted by that. So we look at changes. We look at changes from when I started in the business to where we're at today, and we look at the challenges that we have to face. And we wear way too many hats. We're trying to be everything to everybody. And when you try to be everything to everybody, you do those things that you do less than you would do if you focused on the most important things. But how the world has changed. When I started, basic law enforcement was deterring criminal activity, going out on patrol, shaking doors, making traffic stops, acting on criminal behavior. And over the years, those demands have changed. And now we look at officer safety issues, which I think are critically important. Serving the mentally ill. Our state governments and our federal governments abandoned the mentally ill back in the late 1960s when they closed up institutions across the country and mainstreamed people, and cut back billions of dollars of tax money that was being provided for their care. And they left it to the state and local governments to try to maintain that level of care. And without that money, it fell on our shoulders. And today it's one of the biggest challenges that we face, and one of the ones that we are most unprepared to deal with. Working with transit homeless population, and every community has that issue to address. Life or death, as the chief spoke of, life or death intervention in an opioid crisis. It's a moral dilemma that we face. That we're in a situation where a person's committed a crime, they may be in possession in the state of Michigan. If you're in a possession of what they define as user quantity, an officer comes in to apply naloxone, no criminal charges. No criminal charges, even if the evidence is sitting right there in front of you. You have Homeland Security responsibilities today. Immigration issues are ever present. Conflict resolution, as the chief alluded to. I can't go over and tell my neighbor, quit blowing your snow on my driveway. Michigan, we do have snow. You can't blow snow on my side of the driveway, and instead of going over and saying that, they call us to do that. You've got internet crimes, which are a growing problem for all of us today in terms of what we can address. Greater demands for community engagement, more expectations for us to be a part of community. Building relationships with trust in segments of the community who have historically mistrusted the police. Critically important, and we can't walk away from that. And working with fewer resources when the demand continues to increase. And I think one of the most important things, and to be somewhat facetious, is getting little Johnny out of bed because he doesn't want to get up and go to school and mom and dad can't make him go to school. And when I hear those calls, I want to fall out of my chair. When you talk about expectations beyond our scope of responsibility, I think that's where we need to draw the line. And so many others, and the list can go on. I thought it was important. I was reading an article recently about how some people believe that the broken windows theory has failed law enforcement and has failed in our communities, and I tend to disagree with that. Because I think we've done exactly what was expected of us. I think we went in and addressed the problems on a smaller scale to prevent the much larger problems. What we have lacked is that support. In our community, we've made it very clear with our city government, with the people that we serve, what our abilities are. And we share that. Having the support of the city council and the mayor, and as Kim mentioned, we get phone calls from the mayor. We get phone calls from city council members after critical incidents. Is everybody okay? That's not a history that I come from, to have people in our government actually call and ask those questions. The narrative is to fix the police. I think we've done a good job and continue to do a job in that regard. I think we're doing what we need to do to fix ourselves, and to some extent we did need to. I came from an era in law enforcement that was much different than today. And when we look at the new and what is in the future, the new police officers, and we all make jokes about them, and they're fun to make jokes about with the millennials, but what I see from these new officers coming to our profession is a greater capacity for compassion, greater intellect, greater patience, and those are skill sets that we need to nurture and utilize to our best advantage. I think it's critically important that we look at the values that these new people come to the table with and how they benefit us as an organization. And sometimes we have to overlook some of the other things that are part of that, but I think they bring a different type of police officer to the street. And I think it's been very, very helpful. And just to close, one of the things that we were working on, and we've worked for a long time, city of 75,000 people. At one time, we're down to 82 sworn officers, back up to 86, had been at 105 at one time. It was truly challenging trying to get things done. We had to give up stuff. We had to stop doing things because we just didn't have the resources. But we had to ask ourselves, with all of these things that are out there today on the radar, what really is our capacity? What can we absorb? What can we be honest with our community and say, we can't do that. We don't have the ability nor the capacity to handle that type of an issue. And we found, working with some of the different organizations, we found some support, especially in the mental health issue, is that we were trying to deal with it at the county level from a law enforcement perspective, and decided to bring in the people from the medical and the mental health field to sit down and say, look, we need to work together on this, and put together a collaboration that still is in existence that has been incredible, because we found out that they also had similar problems. They had resources we didn't have, we have resources they don't have, and the net result of that was one of the problems that we had is we did not have a facility for critically mental ill emergent need situations. And out of that group of people sitting down problem solving, we've come up with a facility that will be open next year with 23 beds, where we never had beds for critically mental ill patients. They were put into the general population at the hospitals until they could find a bed in one of the facilities. So we found that the community is willing to step forward and work with us as well. And as I look to the future for our organization, certainly it's in great hands, of tremendous faith and trust in what Chief Coster brings to the table. What I like most about it is she has new and different ideas, and I think that's to the benefit of the community we serve. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So most of our discussion so far this afternoon has really not so much been about technology or the implications of that, or even the really future challenges that are out there, except to the degree that these responsibilities keep sticking to you in different ways. You're almost like a piece of Velcro, while some organizations are more Teflon-like. It slides off them and it goes away. So Curtis, I'm going to throw this at you just from a futures issue. You hear these issues that are popping up all the time from your police chief and fire departments, and probably parks and recreations and other places like that too, where those responsibilities grow. What is your expectations for these organizations as they move through the future and try to wrestle with managing these expectations from the community and or responsibilities that proceed to stick to them? Kurt?
When we talk about our expectations going forward, it's always about, we're going to challenge ourselves, and we're going to challenge ourselves to address the issues of the day and hopefully address the issues of the future. When we reduced police officers, we talked clearly with the council and we talked with the community about what the expectations are of those reductions and what might happen and what is possible in our community if we make those reductions. Part of the reason we do the surveys and those kind of things is to monitor that, and we monitor those metrics and we look at where we are. So as we've approached things like the opioid crisis and defibrillators in our police cars and those kind of things, it's always been about improving public service. But the other issue that comes with that is how much time is taken away from our regular job. So that's where that going in front of our council 6, 7, 5 times and talking about that always comes in, is always keeping them educated about what it is we're doing, what the cost to our organization is. And one of the things that we're doing currently with our organization is we are going back to our council, and we feel that it's time to go back to them and talk about what are the things out there that we can't do and we can't address today as an organization because of the reductions we've made. And is it time to go to our public and talk about money and talk about how would we fund doing additional services in our community, or what would it bring? You know, one of the things we had come up a few years ago was a situation where firefighters wanted to get a SAFER grant, and they wanted to add 6 firefighters. And when we got down to evaluating that, and we had some people in our community that were very passionate about adding those 6 firefighters. But as I said to them, when we add 6 firefighters, what we're really doing is adding about 1.2 people per shift. Is that really improving our service in our community, knowing that the cost to us for those 6 firefighters is going to be $600,000 to $700,000 or $800,000 a year, even with the SAFER grant? So when we talk about what we're going to do for the future, it's talking about what do we do that provides the best value for our citizens. And so as Chief Koster brings me new initiatives or new ideas, we constantly talk about what's the value. What's the value quotient? What's the outputs we expect from our citizens when we do this? And what are we going to tell our council in terms of the reasons, what our expectations are, and what this brings to our community?
Thank you. Kim, as being a new chief, you always want to do your best job in that first year. I mean, that's trying to set the stage for what you can do. But clearly there's some things that we talked about earlier, and I was struck by the conversation about having Narcan in a car, but not EpiPens in a car. So when that next special interest group comes to the table and says, hey, Chief, you can put these in there at this cost, at this training level, how do you ward that off as we move forward? Just as an anecdotal example, but whatever the next special interest is, how do you manage that?
Right, and I think at that point, you'd have to look at your whole operation and say, is there something that we cannot do to do this? And that's kind of where we're at today, because the capacity, I think we're at capacity. And going back to the citizens, going back to the council and saying, this is the proposal, but in order to do this, we might not be able to do that. And I think that's where having a trusting relationship with the city manager and having that conversation first, so that he understands, he understands the issue. That would have to be my approach. We're doing it right now. We have a senior volunteer program that brings us a lot of benefits, and it does a lot for the seniors themselves, and they go out and do vacation checks for people that are on vacation, and they do handicap parking violations for us. And I mean, back in 2006, we had probably 50 plus. I think it might have even been close to 70, and we had a civilian supervisor. But now it's supervised by a sergeant who has a lot of other responsibilities. We've got only 23 because it's really all that we can maintain, and they've been there for a really long time. And now it's almost like, well, they're out there driving city vehicles, and they're up there in age and probably more of a liability than, so we have to look at it and say, is this worth it? But then again, look at, they go home to their families and they talk to the older people that that they hang out with at the senior center, and they talk about the police department and how wonderful we are and the things that we do, and when it comes time to vote, and talk about how people value law enforcement, that's what they remember. So, I mean, you know, it's really, you got to look at all sides of the issues, but just, I guess, be honest, and that's what I'll have to do with Curtis.
Can I just add just one thing to what we do with our council in order to make sure we get the message through? You know, we're a city that doesn't really function that I have to make all the presentations of the council or the chief has to make all the presentations of the council. I really look at my department heads as my experts. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a police officer. I'm a manager. So when we make those presentations, when we talk about these new initiatives, so many of them come from our officers themselves or from people inside that department. We oftentimes let them run with that. We let them talk about it. We let them foster that through their command staff. And those are the people then that are then talking to our council. So the council can see that passion for what we do and what they want to do in our community. It's not filtered through me, and it's not filtered through the chief necessarily. Yeah, the chief makes plenty of presentations, but there's a lot of times when we're seeing lieutenants and we're seeing sergeants and we're seeing others in front of our council talking about those things too.
Jim, to help the folks that are here in the room today and kind of benefit from your experience, if you had to reflect back on the history of your service, tell me one thing you wish you would have done different. And if you were going to be the chief for 10 more years, what's one more thing you would do?
Well, I think, and it certainly is not an indictment across the board. I think the one thing that we have not done very well and have recently started looking at it from a different perspective is take care of our staff. When I started in the business, you know, it didn't matter what you ran into at nighttime. You didn't dare tell anybody it affected you. You just rubbed a little dirt on to get back in the game, and you took it home, and you either drank some beers or did something to deal with it. But we really didn't have a good process by which officers could take care of those things that they see, and they're horrible, horrible things that they see over a period of time. And I wish I'd have started a program much earlier than I did. We started a wellness program in Wyoming, really for the officers to, it was voluntary, but it was a time they could do it while they're on duty on a training day. And we included, and as Chief Koster said, we looked at it as mind, body, and soul. And it wasn't just about physicality. It wasn't taking care of yourself physically, and it was also about understanding the mental capacity that we have. When we talk about capacity here, we're talking about the capacity of our staff, too, to absorb the things that they live with. I mean, you go into a critical situation, you go into a heroin overdose situation. It can be the worst environment you walk into. It's a life and death situation. You're trying to bring back a person from the edge of death. If you're lucky and you bring him back, that's fine. If you don't, then you've got to deal with that consequence. And so what I would wished I had done much sooner was begin to look at the impact that this has on officers in general, and what can we do to help them out. When you look at today, and statistically it's out there, and I applaud the ISCP for really focusing on that the last couple of years, police suicide is a horrible, horrible thing that's been one of the dirtiest secrets kept in our profession. And we lose twice as many cops to their own gun as we do to bad guys, to the people that try to harm them. And we're losing them for reasons that we couldn't take care of many years ago, and that's dealing with the horrible situations that they experience. So looking back retroactively, I wish that I would have spent more time focusing on those issues, letting the officers kind of deal with the stress. Today it's okay. We've had critical incidents where the officers come in, they sit down, and we shed some tears together, and that would never happen 20, 30 years ago. You just were never allowed to do that. And so I think we've become more human in the process, with more understanding, with more compassion. And that's what I talk about with that younger age group. I think they have a better understanding of that than we had coming in. So I look back at that as, if there's one thing that's going to help our profession, it's dealing with those things that we see, you know, not once or twice or 3 times, but we see that in a shift for 10, 20, 30 years. And we have a capacity on how much of that we can absorb. And I think we really need to take a good, careful look at what's happening to our staff out there with some of the things that they have to deal with.
Thanks. If anybody has questions, there's mics in each one of the sections in between the seating there. So please come forward if you have a question. While we wait on that, Curtis, you also sit on a regional control group, if you will, for a regional communications center. And in light of things like Next Gen 911 and managing different pieces of technology that are coming forward, what do you worry about for the next 5 years or so as it progresses and has to be prepared to deal with these different types of mediums that are coming forward and our response as a public safety industry?
I think I most worry about that we can't fund the types of improvements it takes to address, the generation we're in and my daughters are in, they're so much different than us. And I talked a little bit about councils changing and some of our staff members are changing dramatically. And when I look at our 911 system and you look at texting and Snapchat and all those ways that we communicate, we're not equipped for that. And we talk about it quite often in our dispatch meetings. And the issue is how do we become equipped for that? Well, part of that is a self-awareness on our own. I find that more often than not, I'm dealing with police officers, firefighters, chiefs, and others who really are saying, hey, we're doing a great job here, so don't put any questions out there that we're not, because we're really doing good. Well, I'm not saying that we're not performing well, but we're also not preparing for the future. And I think communication is different today. If you look at, we've talked about it up here, social media. The media sources like Twitter more than they like Facebook. We're finding on our Facebook pages today, our citizens are very, very supportive of us. In fact, to a point where if people say something negative, citizens will take care of them. And they'll say, what are you talking about? These people are doing a great job. But the dispatch operation, that very important operation, is somewhat hidden. We don't put it out in front. And most citizens, I think, still believe we make a phone call, somebody on the other end picks up a phone, and then they get on a radio and they call a police officer and a firefighter and say, we need you at X and X address, when that's what dispatch operations aren't that anymore. Dispatch, we've got to educate people just as much about the dispatch process as we do about the police process and the fire process and everything else we do. And that education is going to hopefully help our dispatchers become more responsive, but also our public to understand more about what it takes to make sure we get the proper response. I don't think we're doing a good job being prepared. I think the cost of being prepared and the technology is far outpacing our ability to keep up with it. And we've got to find a way to make those steps that we can keep up with the new technology that's coming towards us.
Kim, you're probably best prepared for this question because you did interviews more recently than the rest of us for jobs. But I'm going to pretend that you're the new chief, which you are, and you're going to tell, if you don't mind telling us, you got a 5-year plan probably in the back of your head. What do you want to see accomplished before your term's up as chief?
Well, for me, because it includes the public safety department, so it includes the fire department as well, the 5-year plan really is to be able to present something to council now that we have our millages. Our millage is passed and it's a non-expiring millage, so we kind of have a baseline. We're understaffed and we don't have enough police or firefighters. So the 5-year plan really is to put together the proposal and at the end of 5 years to be fully staffed so that we can adequately meet some of the demands. And then like Curtis said, technology is something that we just have to keep working at. We don't have the money for it right now. Curtis has always said, safety and technology are two things that he will approve funds for. But again, it's how can we keep up with the technology? I'm not quite sure. So yeah, my plan really is about staffing though, because our staff is just really, they're getting burned out. They're getting burned out not only from the type of call, but from the amount of calls. And at some point where you're either going to have to stop going to calls, which is difficult for law enforcement to do. I mean, we say it all the time, well, we're just going to stop going to that call or this call, and we're problem solvers. So for us to say, well, we can't do that, it's going to take a lot for us to actually say uncle, because I don't want to do that. I don't want to tell our citizens we're not going to come out and dust your car for fingerprints, or we're not going to do this, or we're not going to do that. It's just not in our nature. In fact, preparing for this presentation today, I asked one of my officers, I said, so how do you think we can be everything to everyone? And he said, Chief, I'm just everything to one. And, you know, I thought that was, it tells you what the heart of a cop really is. He said, I've got one person, and that's the call that I'm on. I just go call to call, and I give them my best. So it's hard to develop plans unless you know that you're going to have the funds to accomplish those things. But so basically the plan is to get the plan.
Well, I can't thank each of you enough for being with us today. I think my takeaway probably is the fact that despite we have tons and tons of technology on the floor up above us, really our role in the managerial role of public safety is really try to refocus the staff and resources we have on those key issues that we have talked about today. And also one of my takeaways was that they need to know and be reminded often from a managerial perspective that most of the community provides support for them. That was something that was very important and resonated. And I think, Curtis, from your perspective too, this whole issue of managing capacity against resource and planning for that is a key future issue for anybody in any administrative role or managerial role in the public safety industry. So I thank each of you for being with us here this afternoon, and we certainly thank the panelists, and they'll be here for a short while after this to answer any questions you might have. So thank you again.